He told me I was beneath him on a Tuesday night while I was still wearing the dress I'd bought for my own celebration. He said marrying me had been a step down. Said it like he was reading from a report. 2 weeks later, he was standing in the lobby of my school holding 3 dozen roses, looking like a man who had just realized exactly what he threw away and who already knew it was too late to get it back.
If you're a bottle, my voice, he said. I want to be clear about that. I lay there in the dark and I thought about the last year. The dinners I cooked that he came home late for, or not at all. The weekend trips he canceled. The way he'd started talking about his colleagues' wives, their degrees, their careers, their social connections, in a way that made me feel like a comparison he kept losing. I thought about the 3 years I'd worked double shifts at the Children's Hospital gift shop while he finished his MBA. The money I'd put in, that wasn't mine to spare. The student loans I'd taken out in my name to cover his last semester because we were short and he needed to finish. I thought about all of that lying there in the dark. And then I thought, he's right about one thing. We are not on the same level, but he has the direction completely wrong. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. I got up before he did, made 1 cup of coffee, mine, set out 1 plate, mine. I sat at the kitchen table and ate by myself while the birds outside were still figuring out the day. Marcus came downstairs at 7:20. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the table, 1 cup, 1 plate, no egg whites in the pan, no toast in the toaster, no coffee ready in the French press the way he liked it. He looked at the counter. He looked at me. I said, "Good morning." Calm, polite. Like I was speaking to a neighbor I didn't know well. He said, "Did you make it?" And then stopped himself. I said, "You mentioned that our dynamic wasn't working for you. I figured a good place to start was here." He opened his mouth and then closed it. He got his own coffee. He made it wrong. Too much water, not enough grounds. And I watched him take a sip and make a face, but he didn't say anything. He picked up his bag from the counter. His dry cleaning receipt wasn't tucked in the front pocket where I always put it. His afternoon reminder wasn't on the notepad by the door. I didn't offer the kiss goodbye that had been automatic for 3 years. He stood at the door for a second, like he'd forgotten something and couldn't figure out what. Then he left. I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space. Just space. Like I'd been holding my breath for a year and someone had finally told me I could stop. I didn't waste that first week. Tuesday, I met with a financial advisor my cousin Paulette had recommended. A woman named Sharon, office in Midtown, no nonsense. The kind of person who asked 2 questions and understood your whole situation. I told her where things stood. She asked about joint accounts, separate savings, income split. I told her about the loans I'd taken out for his MBA. She pulled out a notepad and started writing. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Her name was Celestine Ward. My coworker Tamara had used her in her own divorce 2 years back and said she was precise, strategic, and not afraid of anybody's husband. Celestine had an office that smelled like amber and old books, and she listened to me for 45 minutes without interrupting once. When I finished, she said, "Tell me about the loans." I told her, 3 of them, in my name, totaling around $32,000. Taken out during his last year of school when we ran out of money and he was 4 months from finishing. She wrote that down. She said, "And since then, how have the finances worked?" I said I earned $51,000 a year as a second-grade teacher. Marcus earned about 4 times that, more once you factored in his annual bonus. Our mortgage came from the joint account. My loans came from my paycheck. She looked up. "So you subsidized his education and then continued to carry debt that allowed him to build wealth while you didn't?" I said, "That's one way to put it." She smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone doing math. She told me that, in our state, debt incurred during the marriage for the benefit of the household, particularly for a spouse's career advancement, was considered marital debt subject to division. She also said that Marcus's upcoming leadership position and the significant increase in compensation that came with it might well be considered a marital asset, since I had supported the foundation that made it possible. I went home that evening and opened a new savings account at a bank across town. Small transfers. Nothing he'd notice. Just a floor. Just something that was mine. Here's the thing about giving someone exactly what they asked for. It only works if you mean it. I meant it. Marcus had said he wanted distance. He wanted me to stop initiating, so I stopped. I stopped making his plate. I stopped picking up his shirts from the dry cleaners on Thursday afternoons. I stopped leaving reminder notes by the door. I stopped asking when he'd be home. I stopped saving him a seat in my mind. By day 4, the confusion in him was quiet but visible. He'd open the refrigerator and stand there like he was waiting for it to tell him something. He'd come downstairs in the morning and pause at the counter like he expected the coffee to already exist. I'd be sitting at the table, eating my breakfast and reading my book, and I'd watch him, in my peripheral vision, figure out how to make a pot of coffee from scratch. He never asked me anything directly. I think he was too proud for that, or too confused. He wasn't used to silence that didn't need something from him, and he didn't quite know how to be in the house with a version of me that wasn't orbiting his schedule. By day 8, he started calling during the school day. I declined the first one during lunch while Tamara was telling me about her nephew's school play. I set the phone face down and went back to my sandwich. Tamara noticed. She said, "Work?" I said, "No." She nodded slowly and said, "Good." He called again that evening while I was at the gym, and again 2 days later. I answered none of them. Each time I let it ring out, something in my chest loosened a little more. Like untying a knot I'd been living around for so long, I'd stopped noticing it was there. My sister Latrice called on a Thursday. She lives in Charlotte. We talk about twice a week, always have. She knew something was off because I'd stopped mentioning Marcus in conversation. And apparently, Marcus had called her. She told me this carefully. She said he'd reached out about a week after everything happened, said he was worried about me, said I'd gone cold on him and he didn't understand why. I let her talk. Then I told her what he'd said to me that Tuesday night, word for word, as close as I could get it. There was a long silence on her end. She said, "He said that to you? While you were in your dress?" I said yes. Another silence. Then, "Denise, I have to tell you something and I don't know if this is the right time, but I think you need to know." She'd had a conversation with Marcus's mother, Connie, about 2 months back. Latrice had gone to Charlotte for a weekend, run into Connie at a church fundraiser, and Connie, who had always been polished and careful with her words, had said something that struck Latrice as odd at the time. Connie had said, "I keep telling Marcus he has to make a decision." Latrice had asked what kind of decision. Connie had said, about the situation at home, "He's told us it's been over for a while, that he's been waiting for the right time." Latrice said she'd assumed it was just mother-in-law dramatics, that Connie had a way of framing things dramatically. She hadn't mentioned it to me because she hadn't wanted to worry me over something she might have misread. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and let that land. Marcus had told his family our marriage was over. Not that it was struggling, not that we were working on it. Over. Before that Tuesday night ever happened. That speech he gave me wasn't an impulsive moment of cruelty. It was a notification. He had already decided, already told the people closest to him, and had been waiting for the right moment to inform me. Probably after the leadership decision came through. Probably when it was convenient for him. He'd been living in our house, eating the food I cooked, sleeping in our bed, while telling his mother he was just waiting for the right time. I thanked Latrice and told her I'd call her back. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that, not crying, just sitting. Then I texted Celestine, "I'd like to move forward." The narrator receives what seems like a useful piece of financial information, but it turns out to be incomplete in a way that briefly threatens her legal strategy and forces a recalibration. About 10 days in, my friend Jerome, who worked in finance and knew Marcus casually through a mutual friend, reached out to me after I'd confided in him a little. He said he'd heard through someone at Marcus's firm that the leadership position wasn't a done deal, that there had been a restructuring of the senior team and some of the expected promotions had been delayed. He said if Marcus wasn't making partner anytime soon, the income argument Celestine was building around anticipated earning potential could be weaker than I thought. I went back to Celestine the next day. She listened. Then she pulled out a folder. She said the anticipated income argument was actually one of 3 angles she was working. The more central pieces were the marital debt, my loans specifically, and the contribution I'd made to the household infrastructure that had allowed his career to accelerate. The income projection was useful but not load-bearing. She also said she'd already spoken with a financial forensics person who had looked at Marcus's existing compensation, bonuses, and the equity stake he had in a separate consulting arrangement I hadn't even known about. Something he'd started 3 years ago with 2 other people from his firm. She said, the leadership position is nice, but this consulting LLC is what I'm actually interested in. I had not known about the LLC. I sat back in my chair. She said quietly, "He didn't tell you about it?" I said no. She picked up her pen. "Then we have quite a bit to talk about." I was in my classroom after dismissal on a Friday, reorganizing my book bins, when Mrs. Greer's voice came over the intercom. "Ms. Caldwell Moore, could you come to the front office?" Something in her voice. Not alarm exactly, but not routine either. I walked down the hall and looked through the office window before going in. Marcus was standing in the lobby. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the one he saved for client presentations. And he was holding flowers, a big bunch of them, white and blush, wrapped in brown paper. He looked out of place in the elementary school lobby the way expensive things sometimes do, like something that was assembled very carefully and then dropped into a room that had no use for it. He also looked like he hadn't slept well in several days. I watched him through the glass for a second. My colleague Deborah was standing near the mailboxes, not quite pretending to sort through them. Our physical education teacher, Mr. Osei, was in the hallway holding a clipboard he was definitely not reading. I took a breath and went in. Marcus's face changed the moment he saw me. Something that might have been relief, then something more complicated. He started talking before I reached him. He said he'd been trying to reach me. He said he thought we needed to talk, really talk, not just, he gestured vaguely, this. He said he knew he'd said things that came out wrong, that the pressure of the last few months had made him say things he didn't mean the way they sounded. He held the flowers out toward me. I didn't take them. I said, "Marcus, you told me you would set the terms for when we communicate, so I've been waiting." He blinked. I said, "This isn't you deciding we should talk. This is you deciding you're uncomfortable. Those are different things." His jaw tightened. He said I was being difficult. He said I was twisting his words. He said I was standing in my workplace making a scene when all he wanted was a conversation. I said, "I'm standing here pretty quietly, actually." A few of the watching adults made sounds that weren't quite sounds. His voice got lower, sharper. He said I was his wife. He said I had an obligation. He said whatever was going on between us needed to be handled privately, not, he looked around the lobby, like this. I said, "You're welcome to leave whenever you'd like." He looked at me, and I saw the moment he registered that this was not going the way he expected. He had expected me to be grateful he showed up. He had expected the flowers to do something. He said quietly, "What do you want, Denise? Just tell me what you want." I looked at him standing there in his good suit with his wilting flowers, and I said, "I want you to go back to your office. And I want you to start getting used to what your life looks like when I'm not managing it." Then I told him I had an apartment, separate from our house, that I'd signed a lease 10 days ago. The flowers lowered. He said, "What?" I said, "Take care of yourself, Marcus." And I turned and walked back down the hall to my classroom. I sat on my desk and waited for my heartbeat to slow down. My classroom was empty. late afternoon light coming in sideways through the windows, hitting the student artwork hung across the back wall. A drawing of a house, another one of a dog, a self-portrait by a kid named Elijah who had drawn himself with a cape, which I had not corrected because honestly, yes. My Teacher of the Year plaque was on the shelf next to my lamp. I looked at it. 3 years I had cooked and organized and remembered and managed and anticipated and adjusted and kept quiet. 3 years of making his life smooth while mine stayed mostly still. And he had told his mother it was already over. I pulled out my phone and called Celestine. I told her about the lobby. She asked if Marcus had said anything specific. I said he'd asked to reconcile, that he'd offered to explain his words, that he'd brought flowers. She said, "How soon after you filed?" I said we hadn't filed yet. I'd signed the retainer, but we hadn't moved on the paperwork. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Denise, I want to go ahead and file this week, not next week, this week." I said, "Okay." She said, "Monday." I said, "Okay." On Monday, I came in early to set up for the week. Deborah was already in the building. She taught 3rd grade next door to me. She was maybe 10 years older than me, divorced herself with 2 kids, and the kind of quiet steadiness that made people trust her immediately. She knocked on my open door and said, "Can I say something?" I said yes. She came in and sat in one of the small chairs, the student chairs, which should have been funny but wasn't. She said, "I was watching you on Friday, in the lobby." I waited. She said, "I've been teaching here 11 years. I've seen a lot, and I just wanted to tell you, the way you handled that was something." She paused. "Most of us would have either cried or lost it. You were just steady." I said I didn't feel steady. She said, "That's how you know it was real." We sat there a minute. She said she didn't know the whole situation and wasn't asking, but if I needed anything, food, a friend, somewhere to be on a Friday night, she was around. I thanked her. I meant it more than I knew how to say. After she left, I stood at the window and watched my students come in from the bus circle, backpacks too big for their bodies, shoelaces coming undone before they even hit the front door. A little girl named Camille stopping to look at something on the ground. A bug, probably, or a leaf, just completely absorbed in it. I thought, this is real work. This matters. I thought it, and I believed it, maybe more than I had in a while. Celestine called at 11:40 on a Wednesday. She said one word, served. I was in the middle of a reading group. I excused myself to the hallway and stood there with my hand pressed flat against the cool wall. She'd sent the process server to Marcus's firm that morning. Mid-morning, she'd specified. When the offices were full and moving, he would have opened that envelope in front of people. I thought about that for a second, just a second. He had delivered his little speech to me in a hallway in our house while I was still in my dress, while I was holding hope out to him like something worth carrying. So yes, I was fine with the timing. I went back to my reading group. A kid named Darius was trying to decode a word that started with steer, and he was so focused, his whole forehead wrinkled up. I sat down next to him and helped him sound it out. "Steerong," he said finally. "Strong," I said. "That's the word." He looked so proud of himself. After school, I drove to a phone store and got a new number. The clerk was efficient and kind and did not ask why. I changed it in my contacts. I texted Latrice, Tamara, Deborah, my mother, and Sharon, the financial advisor. I did not give it to Marcus. Marcus's mother, who the narrator expected to be an obstacle, becomes an unexpected source of honesty that shifts the narrator's understanding of the situation and inadvertently strengthens her position. I did not expect Connie. She showed up on a Thursday afternoon 4 days after the papers were served. She was sitting in the small plastic chairs outside the main office when I walked past on my way to the copy room. She stood up when she saw me. She was a put-together woman, always had been. Blazer, low heels, pearl earrings. She looked like she was going to a board meeting, not an elementary school. She said, "Denise, do you have a few minutes?" I looked at her. I thought about saying no. Then I decided I wanted to hear whatever she'd come to say. We sat in a small conference room off the hallway, the kind of room that smells like dry erase markers and stale coffee. She started by saying that Marcus had called her the night the papers arrived, that he was upset, that he'd asked her to talk to me. I said, "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not here to take sides." I waited. She said, "What he said to you, what Latrice told me," he said, "I didn't know he was going to do that. I knew things weren't good. He'd told us the marriage was struggling. But the way he said it to you—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "That's not something I raised him to say to anyone, especially not someone who has been as decent to him as you have." I said, "He told you it was over before he told me." She didn't look away. She said, "He did. And I argued with him about it, more than once. I told him he was handling it badly. He didn't want to hear it." I said, "Did you know about the LLC, the consulting business?" Her face changed. "What LLC?" I watched her face, and I knew right then that she genuinely didn't know, that he had kept that from his own mother, too. She said slowly, "What consulting business?" I said, "Celestine can explain the details better than I can." She sat there for a moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "I want to give you my personal attorney's contact information. Not for this. I know you have someone. But she's known our family's financial situation for years, and if there's anything she can clarify about Marcus's assets that would help you, I'd like her to speak with your lawyer directly." I looked at her. She said, "He has more than he's shown you?" I said, "I'm starting to understand that." She left me a card. I gave it to Celestine the next morning. My friend Kezia called that Thursday evening. She said she was looking at Marcus's Facebook page, and what she was seeing was making her teeth hurt. He had posted a series of things, vague enough to read as noble suffering. Things about marriage taking work, about how some people walk away when things get difficult instead of fighting for what matters. He'd shared a quote about loyalty. Several of his law school friends had commented with support. One woman had written, "You deserve someone who shows up. Don't forget that." Kezia was livid. She said, "Should I?" I said, "Yes." I gave her permission to share what had actually happened, not my version of it embellished. The facts, what Marcus had said to me that night in that hallway in that dress, the loans, the LLC I'd found out about, the family he'd told our marriage was over before he'd told me. Kezia had a wide network and no patience for selective storytelling. Within 48 hours, the narrative had shifted. A few of his law school friends quietly deleted their sympathetic comments. One of them texted me directly, a woman named Portia I'd met twice, to say she was sorry, that she hadn't known and that she hoped I was okay. Marcus's posts got quieter after that. Then they stopped. I wasn't doing it to embarrass him. I was doing it because I was done being the secret inside a story he was telling everyone else. 3 weeks after the papers were served, Marcus knocked on my apartment door on a Saturday morning. I'd heard from Celestine that his attorney had reached out, that the LLC situation had complicated things more than Marcus had anticipated, that he was looking to settle, not fight. So I wasn't surprised when I looked through the peephole and saw him standing in the hall. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the good place, the one near our old house. He looked like a man who had not been eating enough or sleeping enough or generally taking care of himself enough. I opened the door but didn't step back to let him in. He held out a cup. I took it. I didn't invite him in. He started talking. He said he'd been doing some thinking, that he'd started seeing a therapist, which I believed because he looked like someone newly acquainted with the idea that his behavior had consequences. He said he understood now that he had said things that were wrong, that his way of handling stress had been harmful, that he hadn't appreciated what I'd contributed to our life together. He said he wanted to make it right. I let him finish. Then I asked him a question. I said, "Is this about wanting your wife back, or is this about the leadership review?" He went very still. I said, "Because Celestine tells me that law firms sometimes interpret a messy, contested divorce right before a major promotion as a reflection of someone's judgment and stability. And I'm wondering if that's the real reason you're here." He said, "Denise, that's not fair." I said, "You told your mother our marriage was over 2 months before you told me. You set up a business with your partners that you never mentioned to me once in 3 years. You gave me a speech about how marrying me was a step down while I was standing there in my own celebration dress. And now you're at my door on a Saturday morning with coffee." I looked at him. "So I'm just asking, which part of this is about me and which part is about you?" He looked at the floor. He said something about how those things were complicated, that he hadn't been transparent, that he should have handled everything differently. I said, "Marcus, the divorce is moving forward. Celestine is in contact with your attorney. The settlement terms are what they are." He looked up. I said, "You were right that night. We were not on the same level, but I think you pointed the wrong direction." He didn't say anything. I said, "I spend my days teaching 7-year-olds how to read, how to think, how to sit with someone who's struggling and not walk away. That work matters in ways that don't show up on a compensation report. I know what my work is worth. I always did." He stood there for a second more. He looked like he was searching for something to say that would change the outcome. There wasn't anything. He turned and walked down the hallway. I watched him go. When he reached the stairs, I closed the door. I stood in my kitchen and poured the coffee into the sink. Not angry. Just done. The narrator gains access to information about the LLC that could significantly strengthen her settlement, but a legal complication briefly threatens to make that evidence inadmissible, forcing Celestine to find a different route to the same outcome. Celestine called me on a Tuesday with something she described as a speed bump. She'd obtained documentation about the consulting LLC through Connie's attorney, who had access to some of Marcus's disclosed assets from an earlier estate planning process. The problem was that how the information had been obtained created a question about whether it could be introduced directly. She said, "It doesn't go away. It just means we have to root around it." She filed a formal request through Discovery for full disclosure of all business interests, equity stakes, and external income sources. This was standard procedure. Marcus's attorney couldn't block it without looking like they were hiding something, which, given that they were in fact hiding something, was a risk they weren't willing to take. 3 weeks later, the LLC was on the table. It was worth considerably more than his annual salary. 3 years of consulting revenue, a client base, a stake in a platform tool 2 of his partners had built. He had built it during our marriage, using contacts and credibility he'd developed during a period when I was still paying off the loans I'd taken out for his MBA. Celestine looked at me across her desk. She said, "This changes the number." I said, "Okay." She said, "Significantly." I said, "Okay." She smiled. Again, not a warm smile. The other kind. The final settlement meeting was on a Thursday in late February. Celestine's conference room, long table, too many chairs. Marcus was already there when I walked in. His attorney was a precise-looking woman named Diana Cole, who shook my hand and said nothing unnecessary. Marcus looked at me when I sat down, not with the confident look I used to know, something smaller, like he was still trying to figure out when exactly the situation had escaped him. We signed for about 40 minutes. My student loans, gone. The full amount, covered through the settlement. A portion of the LLC equity, significant, agreed upon, documented. Half the equity from the sale of our house, which had already gone under contract to a young couple who'd fallen in love with the garden I planted in the back. When it was done, Celestine walked me to the elevator. She said, "You did this right." I said, "You did most of it." She shook her head. "I did the legal work, but you kept your head. You didn't let him bait you. You didn't overshare. You didn't make it emotional when it needed to be strategic." She paused. Most people can't do that when it's their own life falling apart. The elevator doors opened. I said, "Thank you, Celestine." I stepped inside. The doors closed. I looked at myself in the brushed metal of the elevator door. Burgundy coat, natural hair, the same face I'd been looking at for 37 years. But something in it was different. Not harder, just clearer. Like something that had been fogging the glass was finally gone. 6 months after the divorce finalized, I woke up on a Saturday with no alarm set. Made my coffee the way I actually liked it. Strong, no sugar, splash of oat milk. Stood at the kitchen window in my robe and looked at the courtyard below where the magnolia tree was starting to bud. My apartment smelled like the candle I'd lit the night before. Something with cedar and amber, and like the bread I'd baked on Friday because I felt like it. Not for anyone, just because. My grandmother's dishes were in the cabinet. The ones with the gold rim. They were mine, had always been mine, and now there was no one to weigh in on whether they were appropriate for Tuesday night or only for company. I taught my second graders 5 days a week and brought things home in my head. Something Elijah said, a breakthrough Camille had with her reading, a conflict between two boys at lunch that I'd helped them work through using actual words. I thought about my kids on the drive home. I made lesson plans that I was actually excited about. I'd started a small grant application to get more books into the classroom library. Diverse authors, real stories, the kind of books I'd wished my teachers had given me when I was 7. Latrice called every Thursday. We talked about everything. Our parents getting older, a reality show we were both watching, a trip she was planning to Portugal that I was seriously considering joining her on. Deborah and I had started getting dinner every other Friday. We'd found a Haitian spot near the school that had the best pickles I'd ever eaten and a jukebox that somehow always played the right song. Kezia texted me on a random Wednesday to say she'd run into one of Marcus's law school friends at a party, and the friend had asked about me, and Kezia had said simply, "She's great. She's really great." I sat with that for a minute when she sent it. Then I put my phone down and went back to grading. Kezia called me one evening in early April. She asked, first, if I even wanted to hear news about Marcus. I almost said no. Then I thought about it for a second and said, "Go ahead." She said the leadership position, the one he'd been expecting, had not come through. The senior team had restructured. His name hadn't made the final list. A source at the firm, someone Kezia knew through a law school connection, said the people making the decision had been watching how he'd handled the personal situation over the past several months, that his judgment in some matters had raised questions. I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "Are you glad?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No, I'm just not surprised." She said, "That's very evolved of you." I laughed. First real laugh of the evening. Here's the thing I understood. Sitting in my apartment with my cedar candle burning and my grandmother's dishes in the cabinet and a pile of student work on the table I was about to get back to. The thing I had wanted for a long time was for Marcus to see me clearly, to look at what I was doing, really doing, and understand that it mattered, that I mattered. That the woman who woke up early to make sure her second graders had what they needed, who spent her own money on classroom supplies, who called parents on Friday evenings to celebrate small wins, that woman was not a step down from anything. I wanted him to see it. He didn't. He couldn't. And what I eventually understood was that his inability to see it was information about him, not about me. I knew what my work was worth. I had always known. The settlement confirmed it legally, but I'd known before that. Portugal was everything Latrice said it would be. We spent 10 days there in June. Lisbon first, then a train to the coast. I took my journal and filled about half of it. I bought small pottery pieces at a market, bowls mostly, and wrapped them carefully to bring home. My classroom library grant came through in July. 47 new books selected by me arrived in boxes in August. I spent a Saturday morning arranging them on the new shelves and thought about which kids would reach for which ones. I got a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize in late August. I almost deleted it. Then I listened. It was Marcus. His voice was quieter than I remembered. He said he just wanted to say that he understood now better than he had what he'd had and how he'd treated it. He said he wasn't asking for anything. He said he hoped I was well. I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute. Then I deleted it. Not because I was angry. I wasn't, not really, but because there was nothing in that message that required anything from me. No response, no reply, no opening for me to give something I'd already taken back. I put the phone down and looked around my apartment. The magnolia in the courtyard was green now, full summer. The light in the afternoon came in through my windows and hit the bowl I'd put on the kitchen shelf. One of the ones I'd bought in Lisbon, cream-colored with a thin blue line around the rim. My life was quiet. And mine. And enough. And if Marcus ever really understood what he'd had, the woman who'd held his whole life up quietly for 3 years, who'd believed in something he'd been mentally checking out of before she even knew it was ending, that understanding was his to carry, not mine. I was done carrying things that didn't belong to me. The coffee was getting cold and I had papers to grade. I sat down at my kitchen table in the afternoon light, picked up my red pen, and got back to work. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.